Throughout the long river of history, there have always been periods when society is in turmoil and people are anxious. In such chaotic times, we often hear the saying, "In a nation's chaos, loyal ministers appear." This is not only a praise for loyalty, but also a deep reflection on the era of chaos. Today, we will delve into this topic, starting with Chapter 18 of Laozi, to explore the ancient wisdom that enlightens the modern world. Chapter 18 of Laozi, though brief, contains profound philosophy. It uses just 4 sentences to depict the scene of universal chaos. This is not only a review of history, but also a deep insight into the real world. In the turbulent era of the spring and autumn and warring states periods, various schools of thought contended, their ideas shining like bright stars, illuminating the darkness of that era. They tried to use their wisdom to guide the people in the chaotic times, hoping to restore order and achieve social harmony. However, to truly understand that era, we must first understand the root of chaos. In Laozi's teachings, a significant portion is dedicated to discussing the causes and consequences of universal chaos. This content occupies a considerable part of his work, highlighting its importance. Today, we will review these ancient words together and see how they can guide our world today. First, let us recite the original text of Chapter 18 of Laozi. When the great way is abandoned, there is benevolence and righteousness. When wisdom arises, there is great hypocrisy. When the 6 family relations are not harmonious, there is filial piety and kindness. When the state is in chaos, there are loyal ministers. These 4 sentences, like 4 bright lamps, illuminate our path to understanding chaos. Next, we will interpret the meaning behind these words one by one and explore their inspiration for modern society. Regarding the original text, there is some debate. There are minor differences between the Wangbai version and the Silk manuscripts, as well as between the A and B manuscripts, but I believe Wangbai's interpretation is essentially reasonable. The plain meaning is as follows. After the great way is destroyed, there is so-called benevolence and righteousness. With the emergence of wisdom, there is severe hypocrisy. When family members are at odds, there is so-called filial piety and kindness. When the state falls into chaos, there is so-called loyalty. We will explain these 4 sentences one by one. The first sentence, when the great way is destroyed, there is so-called benevolence and righteousness. What does this mean? It says that within the great way, there is originally a natural benevolence and righteousness. We see in Chapter 5 that it says, "Heaven and earth are not benevolent, and the sage is not benevolent." Laozi's so-called benevolence and righteousness, especially emphasized by Confucianism and Moism, are deliberate and limited actions that must be done. These are taught by others, with specific behaviors that people must imitate to meet certain standards to be considered in accordance with human desires. In fact, within the Great Way, there is a so-called natural benevolence and righteousness. People get along together without particularly demanding any good deeds, without particularly talking about any responsibilities or obligations, naturally and harmoniously, because they are all within the Great Way. Now it's not possible. After the Great Way is destroyed, there is so-called benevolence and righteousness. When translating, the meaning of so-called must be added, representing artificiality. In other words, there are 2 kinds of benevolence and righteousness. One is natural, and the other is artificial. Now, the Great Way is destroyed, leaving only the artificial kind, which must be achieved through learning and imitation. The second sentence is, when wisdom arises, there is great hypocrisy. David is severe hypocrisy. How to say this? The so-called wisdom here is not the philosophy we usually talk about, which is the love of wisdom, not that meaning. The wisdom mentioned here is cunning and cleverness. Because people in high positions use cunning and cleverness to govern the people will observe and know how to avoid various damages, just like birds will avoid nets. So when people in high positions use petty cleverness, the people below will try to disguise themselves and perform for you. As a result, the whole society becomes everyone playing a certain role, ignoring people's sincerity and authenticity, causing various chaotic situations. Next, let's look at the third sentence. When the six family relations are not harmonious, there is filial piety and kindness. The so-called six family relations refer to the six roles of father and son, brothers, and husband and wife within the family. In ancient times, it was a society centered on men, so brothers included sisters. The so-called father and son, of course, refer to parents and children. When the six family relations are not harmonious, it means that the relationship between the family members is not good. At this time, there is the so-called filial piety and kindness, teaching you how to be filial and loving. So this idea makes us feel stressed. Why? Because if the six family relations are harmonious, there is no need for filial piety and kindness. Indeed, if the family gets along well, there is no need to particularly say who is filial and who is kind, and it is naturally good. And if a society does not distinguish a certain value, such as filial piety is better than unfilial, kindness is better than unkindness, if there is no such distinction, it means there is no such problem at all. Once you make such a distinction, you have to compare with each other, which means many people can't do it. After this standard is set, it brings greater problems later. For example, a father says to his child, "If you are filial, you should not spend so much money playing games." How does the child respond? The child says to his father, "If you are loving, you should let me play games as much as possible." So everyone looks from their own perspective. The father says to the child, "Why are you not like Xiaoming next door? Their family has no money. He studies very well." What should the child do? The child says, "How are you not like Xiaoming's parents? Their family has no money, but he takes good care of the child." So if people use this standard to demand each other, it will never end, and the family will always be quarreling. So if the six family relations are harmonious, the so-called father's kindness and son's filial piety, brother's friendship and brother's respect, husband's harmony and wife's gentleness, these are not problems. Everyone naturally does these. Looking at the last sentence, when the country is in chaos, there are loyal ministers. This sentence makes people feel more stressed. We say, poor families produce filial sons, and chaotic countries show loyal ministers. Many people therefore advocate that I would rather not be a loyal minister than have the country in chaos. If you have to prove who is a loyal minister by first causing the country to be chaotic, isn't that putting the cart before the horse? Therefore, the best era is when you can't see who is a loyal minister at all, because the country is stable and on track, and every official is seriously fulfilling his responsibilities and taking care of the people. We all know that as long as we mention loyal ministers, we will mention Yu Fei, Wen Tianxiang, Shi Kefa, and others, but it just reflects that it was a chaotic era at the time. The above is what these four sentences mean. Here, the first sentence, the Great Way, is the key. If everything is mixed into a whole, there is no distinction of benevolence and righteousness, no comparison with each other, then the subsequent problems do not exist. So Wang Bai said in his annotation, "Fish forget each other in the rivers and lakes, and the way of teachers forgets each other in the way." His statement comes from Zhuangzi's The Great Master. Zhuangzi said that when the spring water dries up, a few fish are trapped on land together, blowing air to moisten each other and spitting saliva to moisten each other. This is really not as good as forgetting each other in the rivers and lakes. Rivers and lakes are the fish of the big thieves, of course, hoping to swim freely in the rivers and lakes, forgetting each other. But why is the spring water dry? And there is no spring water at all. What is the tongue talking about rivers and lakes? So Wang Bai will say, you have lost the situation where fish forget each other in the rivers and lakes, and then you have to moisten each other with saliva. This situation has appeared. So what is said here is the abandonment of the Great Way, which is actually related to the actual situation. The development of human civilization has come to today. There have been many positive achievements. Relatively, it may also be getting farther and farther away from the source, so that it is difficult to imagine the original primitive situation. How is that harmonious state? Here, you can try to expand your mind as much as possible. Let yourself get along with family, friends, and relatives, seeing that everyone is in the rivers and lakes and forgets each other. That is, do not make too many distinctions. Then gradually expand this range to our fellow villagers, county people, and provincial people, and finally expand to the people of the same country, the same state, to the whole human race, and slowly expand outward. In the end, more than 7 billion people are all human beings, so there is no need to care about each other. Just like all kinds of fish in the rivers and lakes, they have forgotten who they are. One says, like a fish in water, there is freedom. If I personally realize the way, I will know that the way is omnipresent, letting all things form a whole, and this whole is the only real whole. But the spring water is dry, which is a phenomenon that may occur in nature. That is, people have forgotten the way. The result is to create their own predicament. We don't know what situation or when humans began to forget such a way. Forgetting is okay. We can restore our cognition of the way through Laozi's inspiration. So among contemporary Western philosophers, many people, due to the study of the wisdom of ancient people, the study of the wisdom of ethnic minorities or aborigines, have put forward a concept called nostalgia for existence itself. Nostalgia is that I have been away from my hometown for too long, and I miss my heart. The so-called existence itself is the source and destination of all things in the universe, which is also the way Laozi said. When we study Laozi, we often think about whether we have a nostalgia for the way. The way is the source and destination of all things, and all things form a whole in the way. What kind of state is it? We don't need to pay special attention to benevolence and righteousness, and we don't need to pretend to act at all, and we don't need to consider who is more filial and who is more kind at home, and then we don't have to worry about who is a loyal minister and who is a traitor in the whole country. This is the place where we can resonate with Western thought by studying Laozi, which is the so-called nostalgia for the way. This is not because of studying Laozi that it appears, but we originally have such a deep desire. That is, can we return to a certain original situation? We interact with many friends, some of whom get along very well at the beginning, but later problems arise. We occasionally recall that when we were in high school and university, we all got along simply and sincerely, and we were in tune with each other, even reaching the point where Zhuangzi said that good friends can smile at each other and have a reverse heart. But I don't know when it started. There were various misunderstandings and estrangements, so that we have to distinguish whether this friend is good or not, whether it is helpful to me, and it may even change from a friend to an enemy, which is even more worrying. We need to think about what the root is. So in chapter 18 of Laozi, the 4 situations discussed are evolving layer by layer. The root is the so-called Great Way. The Great Way has been forgotten by us. The Great Way has been destroyed. But in fact, this Great Way will always exist, and it will not disappear because we forget it. It will not be lost. It will not come back. It will not. It will always be there, waiting for us to look back suddenly, looking for our roots, just like a fish temporarily in a relatively dry place. He always hopes to return to the lake, return to the sea. Before returning to the sea, he cannot imagine what a beautiful situation it is. After returning, he found that people have always belonged to this sea. People live in the world, and it may take a long time. Maybe when they are old, they will suddenly realize that there are many things in life that don't need to be so calculated, and they don't need to compete with others like this. If you can see this point, the whole life value and level are different. Finally, we can think about what Laozi said. When the 6 family relations are not harmonious, there is filial piety and kindness. This point is a situation that everyone can easily encounter in the family. How can we think about this point further? That is, Is it possible for me to achieve the filial piety and kindness I originally wanted to achieve without the 6 family relations being discordant? Are there any personal experiences or observations that can be provided? I would like to hear your thoughts.